What's going on here? Why is it more expensive? I think there are a couple of things. One is the regulatory environment. Another is permitting, in particular, is really bad in Illinois. And then, of course, everyone's favorite issue in Illinois is taxes. Property taxes are sky high here, second highest in the nation. So you can do this, you can't do that. Parking requirements, lot size, all these sorts of things that when somebody wants to use land, the government steps in and they say, here are all the restrictions, here are all the things you can't do, or by contrast, the things that you can do. Welcome to another episode of the Straight Up Chicago Investor Podcast. I'm your guest, Josh Bandoch. And with me, as always, is your host, Tom and Mark.
Oh, man. He actually tried making eye contact with us, too. That was pretty cool.
That was good.
That was
How's
awesome.
That was cinematic. I like it. We're keeping that.
Okay.
So, man, we this is probably one of the better episodes we have. Just talking about, these are all the things that people, our listeners, quote unquote, complain about. Yeah. And now we're actually talking about, all right, here's some data behind it. Here are some people trying to fix it. Like, there's a lot of good in this one.
Well, everything we talked about today ends up being the challenges that we all face. These are the challenges that ultimately keep a lot of people outside of from investing here in the Chicago market, which is good in one way. But on the other hand, this is what is going to either help people be more prosperous if these things are solved, or stop people from leaving the state altogether. So,
yeah, and we were just talking offline too. These are all of Chicago problems. They're man-made problems. They can be man-fixed, if that's a real word.
Man-fixed. I love that. Yeah, no, when he said that, I'm like, oh gosh, that's perfect.
We got to add that into the intro.
Yeah.
So, all right, let's jump in. Housing provider tip. What do we got?
All right, this seems very obvious, but in the last 2 weeks, I met a couple of investors to save on money with their vacant units. They turn off their heat. They're
No, come on, man.
It's only 50, 60, and it's not going to get cold till next week. I'm like, man, just keep your shit set at 60 degrees or whatever it might be. You know, I think for us, we keep our vacant units at 62 degrees. That way you have a couple days if it does go out with it. Your biggest risk when your property is vacant is like in the winter is your heat going off and something freezing or something busting. So if you have a little larger of a team, you know, make that a policy. Like, so whenever somebody goes in there, for us, if our leasing team goes in there, if our maintenance team goes in there, if our property manager goes in there, we all know to check the thermostat and make sure we're at 62 degrees.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if you have, let's say, you know, you're waiting on permits for a flip or whatever, you know, some of these buildings too, like that I buy, like we just got to turn the water off. Like,
yeah.
Like, right. Like there's no heat in there to start with because you're in demo court or whatever. But whatever you do, like you either need to have heat or you need to make sure that water's not coming to the building. But one of those two things has to happen. That
took me, unfortunately, a few basements full of water to learn that one. But we started actually when we were rehabbing all those houses back in the day, that was the policy. If it was past October 1st, you turned off the water at the main and that way that wasn't a problem. So
yeah, just make sure these are giant assets, like protect your asset, like take the extra 2 seconds, make the extra trip there. Like don't be skimpy here. That's poor. Tell those investors they should be listening to the episode.
Yep.
So that doesn't sound like listeners. All right, let's bring in our guest here.
All right, today's guest, you know, he's a teacher, he's a speechwriter, he is a specialist in policy. Now, at first I thought this was going to be a topic that we couldn't make an interesting episode, but man, this episode turned out to be amazing. I actually met today's guest on LinkedIn. We chatted back and forth, invited him on here. I'm so happy I did. And without further ado, I want to introduce Josh Bandoch. Josh, welcome.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Talk to me, policy. I mean, to me, that sounds horribly boring. Like, how did you get into that?
Oh my God, it is so boring. And yet it's so important because a lot of the problems we face in Chicago, anywhere, or a lot of the great things that happen, they're the result directly or indirectly of decisions that policymakers make. Definitely true with housing. So I guess I got into policy because it's a way to really make a difference. I mean, talk about anything, whether it's poverty, social mobility, housing, regulations, taxes, all this stuff's policy driven. So we'll see if we can make it exciting today.
Well, yeah, appreciate that. The listeners appreciate that. Like, at what point? Like, do you wake up 14? You're like, you know, I want to play high school football. I want to get into policy. Like, how this?
Well, I mean, luckily I knew from a young age that I was going to be a lawyer. That didn't work out. Okay. And then I thought I wanted to be a professor. So I went to grad school, got a PhD in political science, and then taught for a couple of years at a couple of schools. I was at Brown and I was at University of Wisconsin. And what pulled me out of academia, it's many things, some of which are great. it's not practical. And I was always interested in how to practically use my knowledge. So that's what ultimately led me into the policy space. Then I spent a couple of years doing things that seem a little bit sideways from my career. I was working as a speechwriter because I'm really interested in persuasion. I think that one of the troubles that policy folks face is that they have good ideas, the what, but the how we talk about those things, generally not so good at that. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about how we talk about things. That's, for example, really important in the housing space, and we can talk about that. So then eventually that led me to work at a think tank, working on that, plus other policy issues. And then here I am now at the Illinois Policy Institute, doing a wide range of issues in Illinois with my team.
I love that because you bring up such a point there. You know, we've talked a lot on this show recently about the gap between housing providers and tenants' rights or just tenants in general.
Yeah.
And there's never any persuasion. It's more of just like, I'm going to stick my flag in the ground here, and I'm not going to go past this. And it just leaves this huge gap.
And I'm sure we'll get into this, on housing, that's unfortunate because all across the political spectrum, a lot of people are seeing a lot of the same problems and they're seeing a lot of the same solutions, which is why I'm at least optimistic about that space. But how we present those solutions is really important.
The thing, we keep copying different policies from different parts of the country.
Yeah.
But they don't work in the first part. So that's something we'll get into today. Like, I understand why we keep like copying crap. Like, you never copied off of the D student in school. You went for the A student.
We're copying the wrong things.
Yeah. Illinois Policy Institute. Never heard of that up until a few weeks ago. And you talked about what's that? How'd you hook up with them? What's kind of their mission?
So we are a nonpartisan think tank based in Chicago, but focusing all across Illinois. Our goal is to just make the people of Illinois freer, more prosperous, to help them live their version of the American and the Illinois dream. So we focus on a couple of key issues. We look at fiscal issues. That's a big concern in the state, things like pensions and taxes. We also work on poverty and social mobility because poverty is sort of like the antithesis of the American dream because that's all about social mobility. Then we look at other issues, housing, public safety, which in Chicago is in particular a problem, and then some other good government issues just because history. Illinois has a history of a little bit of corruption here and there. So those are some of the kind of big things that we focus on because those are things that are most important to Illinoisans and really just Americans. So we investigate policy, we do the research, what either we think will or won't work, and then we think about how we advocate for that, whether it's through elected officials, talking to them, coming doing podcasts, writing op-eds, publishing research papers. That's the boring stuff, the policy stuff. So a wide range of things to try to advocate effectively to make people's lives better.
As a nonprofit, you're getting funding from somewhere. Maybe you can share that. But how do you say bipartisan when you're usually getting funded? Usually someone's got interests.
So we are a 501c3, which means that we keep the lights on because individuals and foundations like and believe in what we're doing. So we can't disclose our supporters, but it's just lots of, like people down the street, we have so many different people that support us. In terms of how we stay nonpartisan, I guess that's also like being bipartisan is, first of all, we focus on issues and, so housing as an issue. And then for me, especially as I lead our policy team, really trying to think about whatever the issue is, how we can think about that in different terms and talk about that in different terms because people on the left and the right, they have sort of different frames of reference and how they think about things. So if you can present it in those terms, that's a lot more effective. I don't think that somebody who's 80% my friend is 20% my enemy. So I'm really looking for ways that we can talk to, even if somebody only agrees with me 20% of the time, how we can work with them. So I think it's trying to bring that kind of mindset, not a cantankerous one.
Yep. I guess before we dive in, because this world is foreign to me, when you go to an elected official, just talk about, and I know they're individuals, so they're different, but talk to us about that response. Like, is it like, oh, these guys are coming to talk to me, I better listen? Or are you guys kind of having to bang on some doors?
Well, so I guess a couple of things. One is really understanding who they are and what they care about. I'll tell you a story from a couple weeks ago. I went to a meeting with about 30 mayors kind of in Chicagoland, broadly speaking, and the guy who ran it, I came to him afterwards and I said, how can we be helpful to you? There's a guy like in his 70s, and he looked at me almost dumbfounded, and he said, no one's ever asked me that before. It's like, what? That's crazy. So part of it is trying to understand them and what their concerns are. So really sort of leading with that. We have relationships with folks, with Democrats, Republicans, everything. So trying to understand what their concerns are and then leading with those things. So if they're concerned about housing, what about housing specifically? And trying to lean in with that so that we can present ourselves as conversational and as a partner.
Okay. All right. So let's hammer home housing, because I mean that's probably most relevant to our listeners here. First off, just how did you have any background in actual housing before this? All right, it just came up like, all right, this is the issue. Let's go tackle it.
So my background in housing is that, like almost all of your listeners, the first of the month, unless you own a home, that would be the exception. We're all reminded that housing is the biggest line item in our budget. So that was my first experience with housing, paying rent. I own a home while buying a rental property back in Arlington, Virginia. So I guess I know what it's like to be a landlord. But pretty much the answer is no. So how did we get into housing policy? Couple of reasons. One, it first actually came in the context of our poverty and social mobility work. We have a Center for Poverty Solutions, so I lead that research. And if you're low income, housing's a big issue because it's just a disproportionate amount of your income. If you make six figures and you choose to live in Lincoln Park, great. That's just where you decide to invest your money. If you're on the South Side and you're making $20,000 a year and housing is still gobbling up half of your budget, that's a big problem. So it first came in that context, but then we really understood that it is a huge issue in Illinois because Illinois has the highest percentage of homes that are what's called cost burdened. It's a sort of wonky policy phrase, but it means that a home that spends at least 30% of its income on housing. That's how the Census Bureau, that's like their threshold. You might be spending too much on housing. It's the worst in Illinois of any Midwest state. So once we started to see this, I realized, well, I mean, this is really just an issue across the state, especially in Chicago. We need to invest more resources in it.
How does that end up being, though? I guess, I mean, you don't have an answer, but it's like we do have fairly good wages compared to large parts of the country. And we always talk about how pricing is so much lower than so many different areas. How does that end
I
up?
think that's relative to like the coast, though, right? It's all relative, right? Our pricing is good compared to that guy from California coming to invest here. The guy from Des Moines probably doesn't think that.
Gotcha.
And just throwing cities out there.
Yeah,
No
yeah.
offense to Des Moines.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's right. So nationally, if you compare Chicago to like New York and DC and LA, sure, it looks good. And the wages here are pretty reasonable. That's why I compare it to the Midwest. So among Midwestern states, that's, kind of comparing cousins, right? It's like you can look at that. If you look at Illinois versus Wisconsin, that's a good comparison versus Illinois and California. So what's going on here? Why is it more expensive? I think there are a couple of things. One is the regulatory environment. We could talk about that. Another is permitting, in particular, is really bad in Illinois.
Ooh,
I'm
in. Let's
really bad. We'll get to that. And then, of course, everyone's favorite issue in Illinois is taxes. So property taxes are sky high here, second highest in the nation. I would say those are big picture the things that are driving housing on affordability.
Let's take them in order. Let's go through them.
Okay, so let's start with regulations. Again, comparing it to Midwestern states, land use restrictions. Illinois is the second worst in the Midwest, behind only Minnesota. So kind of like nationwide, Illinois is kind of middle of the road. I think it's 30th, where first is best, meaning least restrictive.
Describe what that, go a little deeper on what that actually means.
So basically what you can and can't do with land, especially zoning restrictions. So you can do this, you can't do that. Parking requirements, lot size, all these sorts of things that when somebody wants to use land, the government steps in and they say, here are all the restrictions, here are all the things you can't do, or by contrast, the things that you can do. So an area that would be, score extremely well on this would be a place that has essentially by right zoning, right? Like you can do whatever you want with the land. There are few or no restrictions on it. So Illinois is kind of middle of the road nationally, but in the Midwest, it's, not so good. So put a lot of restrictions on what people can and can't do in Chicago in particular, which is, I know, of more interest to the listeners. So lots of restrictions. Chicago, only 21% of land is zoned for multifamily housing. That's not a lot. So you have, I think, 44, 46%, something like that, maybe 41, above 40% is zoned only for single family housing. So that's an example of a restriction. There are minimum lot sizes, there are parking requirements, and they're not necessary. You look at Minneapolis, I think in 2018, they actually removed a lot of restrictions. And when you look at what has happened to rent in Chicago versus Minneapolis, in Minneapolis, it's stabilized, and in Chicago, it's went up a lot. When you look at supply of properties, it's went up in Minneapolis in a way that it hasn't went up in Chicago.
What were some of the regulations or restrictions that were cut back in Minneapolis?
So they removed minimum parking requirements, for example. There were 4. Lot size, they reduced lot size.
Which is ridiculous here. Like, I've literally had to buy the lot next door to meet parking requirements to do things in the past.
It's even like I've been very vocal about the ADU program, but like, you can't eliminate parking. It's like, well, how do you want me to build? What do you want me to do here? Like, I'm trying. Like,
either now or sometime that I'd love to dive into ADUs, because this is like one of the craziest things for me. We can just do it now if you want while we're on it. Or do you want to stay on the regulations? And
let's finish the regulations. Yeah. And let's move to it though. But yes, we're gonna hit it.
I mean, then there's just basically zoning and all the things you can and can't build. ADUs would be an example. It's highly restrictive in Chicago. You just have these whole swath of regulations that just make it hard to build. And I was talking to Lincoln Park Builders Association a couple weeks ago, and I was like, I don't know how you guys do this. And then you have more restrictions that come in. I know you had this someone on the podcast recently, the Northwest Ordinance, right? It was just like, I mean, and if you think it's going to stay in Northwest, like what happens in one ward doesn't stay. So it's like putting all these restrictions, especially on people who just want more housing, like you two, right? You want more people to have more housing, and putting restrictions on that makes it hard. So just a long list of things that Illinois does worse than other Midwestern states that just make it so restrictive. And Illinois in general has a really restrictive legal code. So there's one organization that just looks at all the instances of, quote, restrictive language in Illinois' code, just things you can't do. And the average nationally this is already really crazy, 132,000 instances across the legal code. The best is Idaho, it's 32,000. Illinois has more than double the national average, 282,000 instances of restrictive language. That's like, everywhere you turn, the state of Illinois is saying, no, you can't do something. And in housing, it's just one area where it's bad.
So how is this so hard to fight, though, right? Because if everyone wants affordable housing, like, who is it advantageous for to not reverse this? Right? I get like, I understand like some things where like we don't agree, and that's fine. But like, who is on the other side of this saying like, no, let's not build? And I understand like, hey, don't go build a gas station in the middle of a neighborhood. Like, I understand why there needs to be codes. But like, a lot of this restriction, like, who's benefiting?
Well, there's certainly a political element to it. So you two operate in Chicago, and there's this thing called aldermanic privilege, where aldermen can basically decide what does and doesn't happen in their turf, their territory. Is that a good way to remove restrictions and increase housing supply? Not really. I think part of it is just a default in the administrative state, the bureaucracy that's like, they know best, right? We know what areas do and don't need, instead of builders and real estate folks and just people saying, we want to live there, that they kind of know best. So, there was a rule and permit, sort of a chunk of rules and permits open for public comment over the summer. So I did what policy wonky people do, and I looked at them and I commented on them. And one of them is like absolutely crazy in Chicago, that there's like an economic like use justification that if you want to request a use change for a property, you have to justify that the economic benefit from what you can do today to what your use change would allow, that economic benefit is big enough. There's no explanation of what that is or how you would determine that. So you basically just have to make something up, and then the regulator who is reviewing your application has to decide, oh, well, that's enough, we're going to approve this. So there's this sort of default that like somebody else knows better than the builder.
You do that even with the zoning. So if you're trying to adjust zoning, or even I was just trying to break the zoning line or the variance, like I had to justify why doing this will bring in more property values and all that stuff.
Yeah, it's
And
It was all just made up.
well, exactly. You just make it up, and there are no standards. So you just have to kind of hope. And I mean, for me, my standpoint would be if my use changes that I want to start a Dunkin' Donuts or my own donut shop or whatever, or just build a 5-story building. The way that I'm going to know if that was a good idea or not was whether I make money or not.
Yeah.
Do I go out of business, right? Do you have tenants in your properties? If the answer is no, that was a bad idea. And if the answer was yes, that worked out just fine. So part of it is this default in Illinois in particular that somebody else knows better than the builder, the tenant, what they need. And I think that's the default mindset, whether it's the regulator or it's the politician who knows that, well, this is what their ward needs.
Yeah. I also think there's a little bit of built-in not in my backyard, right? Like we've seen that.
Totally.
We've seen that too, where it's like, all right, if you live in a nice little bungalow and someone wants to build a 6-unit next door.
Yes.
Right? Like you're gonna be like,
100%.
F you, like I don't want that. And then that is a voice to the alderman, and the alderman says no, and then no more housing gets built.
Yeah.
I understand that side of it.
100%. Please, thank you for pressing on that because NIMBYism. I don't know if I love the term because it's like, oh well, you're a NIMBY and we just call it something else, like whatever it is. Basically, people are saying, yeah, more housing, but not here. And I think one thing that we need to do is explain what the bad consequences of that are, because they say, well, look, we want to preserve our community. So I would say, okay, where are your kids and your grandkids going to live? Because if you don't allow more housing here, they're not going to live here. Maybe they have to move 30 minutes, 2 hours away, or maybe they just leave Illinois, which is what a lot of people are doing. And what kind of community do you want? So if you're in Lincoln Park or Lakeview, do you want a community only of rich people who are, generally of one ethnic group? Or do you want a more diverse community that's open to people that might be middle income or might be even lower income? Or do you want this really exclusive community? I wanted a community where, if middle income and low income people want to live in Lincoln Park because they're in an ADU that is like, 400 square feet, great, hooray for that. When we put those restrictions, like, I don't know if that's the kind of community that we want that's just really excluded, but I think we need to make those kinds of arguments and people say, oh, well, like not here. Well, then like what's not here?
Well, what you just explained was the difference between long-term and short-term thinking.
Totally.
Like that's exactly, and no one thinks long-term. They're not thinking about their kids. They're thinking about what's going to happen next summer.
Yeah. Same along this line of the long-term thinking. One of the Jay Parson, who's a great follow on LinkedIn. I think I've mentioned him a few times on housing, but one of the things he's brought up too is the long-term effect of building new construction housing, because that becomes your vintage in 20 years, 40 years. It becomes part of the solution, but it's planting the tree right now and no one sees that. Like it becomes, you need it now and it's going to be brand new regardless.
Yeah.
Right. Like
100%.
It becomes that vintage product 40 years from now. Like it's the long-term solution, and you start now. You should have started 40 years ago.
Yeah.
But we keep deferring, and like supply's not going anywhere. It's just it's stagnant. It's crazy.
I mean, it's really stagnant, and more on that in a second. It's, I think part of it is really asking the question, what kind of community we want. And some people will say, well, we want a community, even just buildings that look a certain way. And that's why things like ADUs are great, because they're what's called light touch density. So you can preserve the character of a neighborhood by allowing, say, just more lots on one property, but, or ADUs, things like this. So you can preserve the character by at least opening up more housing. So there are a lot of ways you can at least scratch some of these itches, I think, if you frame things the right way and if you're offering policies that are going to at least be congruent and at least help supply. But ultimately, people aren't building in Chicago, and compared to other areas, big cities, Chicago is way, 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 way behind, and Illinois is way, way, way behind.
Yeah. All right, so we talked, the other points we talked about permit processing and so forth, but we've mentioned ADU a few times. Let's jump there because that's a big one.
Totally. So your audience knows what an ADU is, but basically it's a coach house, a granny flat, an English basement, something, right? You're adding on to a property, and Chicago has a really restrictive ADU policy, which is really harmful for people who need affordable housing. So there's a ordinance from a couple years ago that like slightly opened up ADUs, So there are 5 pilot areas in the city with all these crazy restrictions on them. So it's already a limited number of areas. And then what you can do in the areas is different. So there are 2. There's one in north and northwest. They're much less restrictive than the south, southwest, and the west pilot areas. So we've seen basically like no ADUs built for a city as large as Chicago. It's a tiny number of ADUs built in the last like 5 years. So the current ordinance isn't working at all. So there was a proposed ordinance which looks to be tabled for now that was introduced in the spring of this year that would have eliminated the pilot areas and then would have just allowed ADUs across the city and would have at least removed a lot, although not all, of the restrictions on them. And that appears to be at least tabled for now. Dead, I don't know. So that's like basically ADUs are highly restrictive, and this hurts especially people in the poor and minority neighborhoods the worst in the South and the West Side. And it's a huge problem for supply because if you look at LA, which is like, they have a great ADU policy. It's really easy to build. Those homes are much more affordable. It costs about 1/3 of the price to build an ADU in LA versus building a home. And they've had, in the last 5 years, like 27,000 ADUs built. I mean, just imagine if
How many have we had? Is there like a rough number?
less than 1,000 over that same time frame.
That's insane.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Like that's
And it's because it's so restrictive, and it's bad economics, and it's bad social policy because the areas that most need affordable housing, or that you would want to open up to affordable housing, like Lincoln and Lakeview and Lincoln Park, it's not there. And ADUs is it's a nice simple way for people to move into those neighborhoods.
So from the outside here, it sounds like aldermanic privilege ends up being probably the biggest roadblock to doing something like this on a scale.
Well, the ADU program, the one thing it got right is you get to do the zoning aspect of it by right, right? So like you don't need to go kiss the ring of the alderman, like I quote unquote put an envelope, however you want to phrase it, right? Like, but like you get rid of that part of the equation. But then there's no relief from the Department of Building, right? Like there's no relief at all. And so you have, if your basement's 6'10", you got to gut it, and now you're at 6 figures, right? Like there's no relief at all. Like, all right, this is existing, it's not 7 feet, but we can work with this. Like the whole thing is just, there's no way to do it under 6 figures, right? And then like to build a coach house, like I've gone through the experience, like the way they make you do it, like it only makes sense in an area like Lincoln Park or Wrigleyville because the rents can match the demand to match your construction. But like if you want to do it in Jeff Park or Portage, like you're going to take a bath on it. Like it doesn't add up because there's no relief there.
And I would just, so the 2020 ordinance was at least a tiny step forward, and there were still a lot of restrictions. And the ordinance that was proposed this year still had a lot of restrictions that are well-intentioned and end up hurting people. One of those is affordability requirements. Really spicy subject, but I'll just dive in.
Let's go.
That's okay. So the proposed ordinance, again, they would have removed a lot of the restrictions, still maintained affordability requirements. What that means is
on the second one, right?
Well, so on after the first, every other unit. So the third, the fifth, the seventh, the ninth.
Yep.
And basically, you have to offer that third, fifth, seventh unit at 60% of area median income. So what that means is that that's just not affordable. I mean, you just sketch out the math briefly on different properties, like 6 figures just to get this going. Are you then going to commit to your third or your fifth unit being at way below market value?
No.
It's not affordable for you. So effectively, even this new ordinance would put a hard cap at 2. Right? No one is going to build that third unit because they don't want to deal with the affordability requirement.
Now, why would they put that even on there? The affordability requirement on there? Like, what's we see the unintended consequence, but what's the front side of like, hey, we should have this in here because of blank?
It's well intended to bring affordable units to the neighborhood, right? That's the intention, but no one's done the math to be
the math doesn't matter.
Crap, this doesn't work. Like,
so the front end people are not, the people putting this in place are not real estate investors. They're not the finance guys. They're not they're not doing the math for it. Is that what you're saying?
That's my understanding is that we have the expert here.
And so these are...
We should stop talking.
Talk more, please, because, you know, the policy dude, that's great, but like you guys are on the ground with this stuff, which is one reason I'm delighted to have this conversation. So political or, you know, administrative folks, what are they seeing? Why do people think that affordability requirements, quote unquote, are a good idea? I think part of it is they think, look, housing's expensive, and if you're poor, it's a huge part of your budget. So what do? We just mandate affordability. We just say that a certain number of units are going to be, quote unquote, affordable. And you just fiat that into existence. Like, you can kind of get the impulse there. And then, okay, well, especially in areas that are expensive, Lincoln Park, Lakeview, Wrigleyville, whatever, you got to mandate that. It's just that when you look at what's happened in all the places, this is essentially a form of rent control, right? When you look at all the places that have done that, Cambridge, Massachusetts has done it, for example, it's never worked. It decreases supply, and it doesn't make housing more affordable for poor people. From our standpoint, the best way to promote housing affordability is to increase supply. And, you know, does everyone get to live in Lincoln Park or Lakeview? No. But you have more supply in more areas, you're going to open up better areas to more people, and you're going to open up more housing that's more affordable to more people. But that's the impulse, just fiat it into existence.
Yeah. And I'd say the other thing too is that if there's some sort of incentive. So one of the things I think that Illinois has actually gotten right, the ASAP program, the Affordable Housing Special Assessment, whatever, it's a huge acronym, but this is where I think it's 7 units or above. We had Kagi on, and we can link to the episode, but he talked about it, and we've done it several times with Drexel. We've done it several times now, where if you keep your rents at X amount of level, like they have affordability requirements, and they're normal, they're reasonable numbers. They're not insanely low, and you put an X amount of work into the building, it's a huge tax relief. It could be 15% or 35% of your assessed value goes down, right? And all of a sudden, like, you're incentivized to provide affordable housing, and the math does math, right? Like, you have the relief coming, like, all right, I'm not going to gun you on your property taxes. Everyone wins here. But like, if you don't do that when you're building, like, it's not going to work. Like, it is what it is.
So some things are less bad, and in an ideal world, we don't live in that world. I would just rather folks who build housing, construction companies, you all make these things possible, and then just either home buyers or tenants that they're the ones who are deciding, I want to live here or I don't want to live here. Like, are you going to go build a 30-story building and like brand new on the south side? Probably not, because there's just maybe not demand for it. But you're going to build things and you're going to sell things, et cetera. Tenants are going to live in places. You're going to buy things where there's demand for it. So when the state steps in, it's already disrupting that in a way that's like they're deciding what you can build, when, and it ends up still putting restrictions and a cap on what's built, or at least contorting what you would do otherwise.
But supply will ultimately make it affordable. If you
Totally.
loosen up on restrictions and you're putting all these, just say market rent today is $3,000, and you put 100 of these 3,000s in there over a 3-4 year period. Now all of a sudden that there's not gonna be enough people to fill it, and those rents will go down a little. And then the next neighborhood, it's like, oh man, if I could go live in this neighborhood for $2,700, so these ones go down a little bit, make it a little affordable. So not what any of our listeners want to hear about rents going down, but what it creates, that solves the problem. Then it actually trickles down rents in all the different surrounding areas.
Well, I think what your listeners might want to hear is, in, I think, a better environment, it's going to be easier for them to build things, to own things, to rent things. And part of that is, right, the supply of it. And then you're going to have more renters for those properties. So I think that long term, that's better. It's just getting over a lot of these hurdles, whether it's the local folks saying we don't want those things here, the politicians losing control, the regulators not getting to decide what happens and what doesn't happen. Yeah, I mean, if you own a building, would you rather 3,000 versus 2,000 versus 4,000? Sure, you'd rather 4,000, but you also want a robust environment where if you want to build something else, you can do that. If you want to convert your property, like I live in Wrigleyville, and there could totally be a coach house in our backyard. I expect that it's, just basically cut the trees down. I expect it's extremely cumbersome to do that. So like, why would they? But if I own that property, I would want to be able to build that coach house, and I could rent that for good money, even if it's only 1 bedroom.
Yep. What have we seen any policy where the lack of regulations, the flip side of this, the lack of regulation has been like, whoa, we need to step in? Like, are there like just wild, wild west states where this is worth the other way? I don't know if I'm phrasing that very well.
In the sense that the lack of regulation has had some particular harms.
Correct.
I mean, my intuition.
I'm thinking like a Simpsons episode where you have like, the nuclear
Right.
plant coming next door.
Well, so let's
Three
think
eyes.
about.
Yeah. It's like,
So let's maybe think about the state that's probably the least regulated, and that's Texas.
I think we all could have guessed that, right?
Right. Yeah.
Well, so like, what are the consequences of that? If you look at, is it homes built or permitted? I could confirm this, but Houston versus Chicago. So if you look at the top 10 largest metropolitan areas, this includes New York and LA. Chicago is dead last, and Houston is, and I'm confusing if it's permitting or homes built. It's 4.5 times more. Chicago is like 160 something. I might even have it on my phone right now, but I won't do that. And then Chicago is over 900. So
Or Houston, you're saying over
Houston,
900.
sorry. Chicago's like 162 and Houston is like over, I think 910 or so. So that's, I mean, orders of magnitude. So what's the consequence of that? People are moving to Houston because you can buy like a 4 or 5 bedroom home for what a little 2-bedroom costs in Lincoln Park. You have like a yard and things like that.
And the taxes are probably a quarter of what they are here too for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, does Houston see probably some growing pains from things like that? I would imagine so. Probably have to deal with infrastructure, though that gets a little more complicated in the short term, but then you plan for it in the long term. Have to build schools. That's also a thriving community where people are excited to move to. So I don't pretend that, like, if you build a 3-flat or a 6-flat in a place that was just in Lincoln Park, a single family home, does that come without any friction? No. And if you just Google NIMBYism and you go to the Wikipedia page, there are like 15 or 20 concerns listed there, and they're understandable concerns. And again, it's still, what kind of community do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a thriving community where people are flocking there and then they're building their own community there and it's vibrant? Or do we want to live in a place where the community is shrinking and it's restrictive and people feel like there's no future there?
And the news is always negative.
Correct.
That's the other
and
thing.
that's what we experience in Chicago. So every 6 minutes, a mom, a dad, a grandkid, a neighbor, a friend, a coworker, they leave Illinois. So what kind of community do we want? I want a thriving one. And one of the most important things for individuals and families is housing that's affordable. So are there trade-offs? Of course. And are there growing pains? Certainly. I don't think, though, we've seen, look at LA, where they have basically ADUs more or less by right, 27,000 in the last 5 years. It's amazing. Just scale it to Chicago, even if that's 9 or 10,000 ADUs. I mean, imagine what that could do for the city. That's great. That's all across the city, especially probably in areas like Wrigleyville, Lincoln Park, where you're going to make really good money on that.
1,000, that number is scary low. In 4 years, so there's 250 a year. Like, that's insane.
Yeah.
Like,
We have some research on this published. I mean, it's crazy low. And in the south, southwest, and west side, those pilot areas,
Zero.
It's like double digits.
But I really think where people will take advantage of some of that stuff will end up being in the Hyde Park and Garfield, East Garfield Park, stuff like that. Some of these edge ones where they could squeeze out another unit on that property, I think that ends up being a lot of opportunity missed as well.
Yeah.
Man, that's nuts. All right, we've touched on taxes just a little bit.
Yeah.
Solve our tax problem in the next 30 seconds. Ready, go.
Illinois has the second highest effective property tax rate in the nation, behind only New Jersey. That's a crushing burden, and it's more than double the median. So I don't want to see Illinois and Chicago, necessarily. Actually, any guesses on the state with the lowest property taxes? You're never going to guess.
I'm just going to guess like a Wyoming or something like that.
Hawaii.
Really?
Funny, right? Yeah, funny. 0.32%. That's because for people who are living on the islands, it's really low. If you're not a resident but have your second home there, then they kick up your property taxes.
it.
But they know people are leaving, so you got to keep them there somehow, and that's what low property taxes. Also, market property is so crazy expensive. So I don't want Illinois to drop to 0.32%. That's just not realistic, and it's not possible fiscally with all the pension issues. But get to the median. Now, part of it is that you can't drop taxes dramatically until you solve the pension problem. That's a conversation for a separate podcast. But what do you see? You see people fleeing. And 97% of people who left Illinois the last census year, which is 2022, for which we have data, 97% of them went to states with lower taxes. So you do the math. And Illinois isn't just losing
Well, it's
population.
almost impossible not to.
Right? Well, that's true.
That percentage makes very much
Pull
sense.
up for Jersey.
And you could say, oh, wow, they're just going to states with better weather, Florida, Texas. No. Illinois lost population to all neighboring states, including Wisconsin. I lived there. Madison is colder than Chicago. It's not windier, but it's colder. My eyelashes have not frozen in Chicago. They froze in Madison, Wisconsin. So people don't move there for the weather. So here's what happens. When people leave, the tax base shrinks, which means that the number of people bearing the burden of these high taxes is smaller, which means that burden can't decrease. That's why we need this thriving community. Chicago used to be this was over 100 years ago, not the largest growing city in the Midwest or in America. There was a period of time when it was the fastest growing city in the world. So Chicago can be a vibrant place, and that tax burden is a tremendous disincentive.
Okay. So how do we get out of this loop, right? Like what's like step one? Because I hear what you're saying. It's the same thing, with if you're in an organization with dues or even if like the small community, like private schools, like you lose enrollment, like tuition goes up for everyone else. Like, how do we get out of that spiral?
You got to make this a place where people and businesses move. I mean, even just in the real estate and building space, like if you could build in Chicago versus Houston, what do you pick? You pick Houston. It's just so much easier. Florida, right? It's like, okay, let's do that. So you got to attract people here. You got to make this a destination city and a destination state. So what do families care about? They don't want to be tremendously burdened with taxes. Otherwise, go somewhere else where there's no income tax and property taxes are low. And you want to have good schools. Just the basic things that families want, what they care about. They want it to be affordable, want to have good wages. Chicago does have good wages, so it has that going for it. It's just that there are these other things that are real barriers to coming or that are just incentives to leave. So if you can't solve that problem and you can't make this a destination city, long-term, Chicago is going to continue to have some serious pains.
In the national spotlight lately, it's been a lot of talk about reducing the size of government. Do you think that carries? You think that's ever anything that could get changed here in the state? Because no matter what, it's still very sizable.
It is big. Let's look at the CTA as an example. We've done some research on this, published that back in October. So the CTA. The budget has continued to increase big time. Part of this is COVID funding. Big time increase in budget, while at the same time, from pre-COVID levels, ridership is only about 60% of what it was. So ridership is way down, and yet budget is way up. So like you do the math there. That doesn't make sense. And
I would love to own a building where I could be 60% occupied, have my expenses go through the roof, and just everything's fine.
Yeah.
Like that'd be great.
well, because who pays for the CTA?
Yeah.
We do. So that's not fiscally sensible. Like you said, if that was how you ran your buildings, you'd be declaring bankruptcy pretty soon. So the CTA's response has been, hey, can we have more money? That's not sensible. So I would love to see some downsizing. Mayor Johnson did in his more recent budget proposal, one thing he said, well, we're going to eliminate some open positions. That's a start. Unfortunately, a lot of the openings he proposed eliminating were in the police department, which is the last place in Chicago that you would want to eliminate openings. So like you have a growing government in Chicago with a shrinking population. That math doesn't add up. So I do think streamlining personnel is one place to look at because it's expensive.
So real quick, I think most listeners, probably all listeners, agree with you. How does this actually happen with politicians, though? Because no one wants to be the guy cutting jobs.
Yeah.
Like, how does this actually happen? Or does it?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. Just in general, with size of government, you got to feel the squeeze a little bit. And I do think that Mayor Johnson is just looking at the raw numbers and saying, I got a problem here. I got a $1 billion gap. How do I close it? Now, I think increasing property taxes is not the way to do that, given how burdened Chicagoans are already. But I think part of it is just dealing with those difficult fiscal realities. And they're coming to a point when you cannot possibly ignore them. And 50 aldermen, this is the first time this has happened in like decades, they voted down something from the mayor. They said, no, we're not going to do a $300 million property tax increase. Mayor Johnson has come back with 150. I don't think that's going anywhere either. So part of it is just the cold, hard reality of a bad fiscal situation. Eventually, you have to make adult decisions. So that might be the only way that this gets addressed, is just things get bad enough that people say, we can't do this anymore. And Chicagoans have said that too. The only time that Chicagoans were asked directly, do you want to increase taxes, was early this year on the real estate transfer tax. And Chicagoans resoundingly said, no, we don't want that. They saw through it as just another way to drive up taxes and drive people and businesses out of the city. And I can imagine that if Chicagoans were asked to vote on a $300 or $150 million property tax increase, we all know that would get voted down like 80 to 20.
Yeah. So where do we go from here? Like and let's talk about you guys directly. Like you go and have these conversations. Yeah. Is it a lot of, let me rephrase. Like when I go talk to like an alderman or whatever, it's like you shake hands like, all right, yeah. And like you leave there and you're going like, nothing's going to happen on this, right? Like, you know, everyone's singing Kumbaya and everyone's happy, but like nothing actually happens. So like, how are you guys working to actually get this to happen? Because everything you're saying, every one of our listeners is in their car driving going, yep, man, yep. Like, how do we actually move the ball now?
Well, a couple of things. I'm going to say something that's maybe a little bit unconventional. I think that there is an opportunity to advance some of these things at the state level. And that's what you've seen in other states like California. California has its problems. They have just stepped over localities and said, no. Housing is a serious issue here. It is not affordable. So you can do some of these things at the state level. So you can just, for example, cities of a certain size, you can then say cities above that size, like by right zoning or ADUs or whatever, reduce lot size, things like that. And I do think at some point it might be necessary to look to Springfield to see if they might reduce some of these restrictions. And some folks have already talked about that. So that's one avenue, because if you wait for aldermen or politicians in Chicago or other cities for that matter, they are reluctant to give up that control because it's power. So I think that's just one place to look, is maybe just outside of Chicago to solve Chicago's problems. Mayor Johnson did release what I thought was a good report earlier this year called Cut the Tape, that at least in theory, points towards removing some of the restrictions. 7 months in, I don't think we've seen a lot of that. And when the ADU ordinance came up in the spring, that essentially got tabled. So I think that the report does outline some good principles, but we need to see what actually happens from that. So otherwise, I think it's just building a coalition of folks, because sure, I can go talk to aldermen, you can talk to them, but if they're hearing from lots of different people and they're like with clarity from lots of groups hearing that these things are problems, so take the Northwest Ordinance. There's a coalition of groups that is now working to get that at least sunsetted in a couple of years, or at least less bad. And if folks weren't pushing that from a lot of different angles, that wouldn't happen. It's just that all of them have to understand that it's actually not in their interest to do these things. If they see that it's not in their, especially short-term political interest, they'll reconsider. But otherwise, giving up automatic privilege, that's probably not going to happen. And they like having control over that. Only when that control is not in their interest would they consider stepping back.
Yeah, man, good stuff.
Yeah.
Anything else before we wrap?
No, I'm ready.
All right, let's do it. So I know you've listened to a few, so hopefully you know our wrap-up questions here.
All right, what's your competitive advantage? How have you been able to go so deep on policy when other people in your field wish they could?
You mean my personal competitive advantage?
Yes.
I think that one thing that I'm good at is stepping back, seeing the big picture, and just distilling lots of information. So on housing, for example, really understanding that there is bipartisan consensus on observing the problem, which is that housing is increasingly unaffordable in America, and that the solution is to remove a lot of restrictions and to increase supply, and that I don't get stuck on the why. And a lot of people do. A lot of people see those two things, but then they say, well, folks on the left and the right, they have different whys. Folks on the right say, well, why is that bad? Because it's an infringement on my property rights. And people on the left say, why is that bad? Well, because it hurts poor people. I don't care about that. If we can observe the same things and have the same solutions, the why is almost irrelevant to me. And that doesn't stop me in a way that it stops most people.
Yeah, I like that. All right, give one piece of advice you would tell someone that is yet to buy their first property here in Chicago.
Two things. One, don't buy in Northwest where the ordinance was just passed. But I think, probably more than that is just if you're going to be a property owner that's renting things out, you got to look at the areas where it's less difficult to make the use changes that you want so that you can grow the value of your property.
What do you do for fun?
Play tennis and spend time with my family.
Have you converted over to pickleball, or is it pure tennis?
Tennis. And the worst thing, this is the worst. Look, pickleball is great. It gets people active. However, when they
take away your courts.
Well, when they paint their lines on the courts and then it's just hard to see. And then the courts are all taken up by pickleballers and I just want to play tennis. But they did, up by Lincoln Square, they built pickleball courts. And I said, that's genius. Do that, please. So, That's my answer to pickleball.
They're doing that all around the suburbs. So they're building separate courts.
All right, give us a good book, podcast, or self-development activity that you'd recommend to our listeners.
Danny Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics, and he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And he basically founded behavioral economics. It's a radical shift in how we think about the world because think tank people can bottle decisions and, logically what should you do, but just really understanding how people behave, I think if you can do that, it's just a radical shift in everything you do. So Thinking Fast and Slow.
I've listened to that book a couple times, but I also put that book on when I can't sleep at night. It puts me to sleep in 2 minutes. It's tough to actually listen to, but his voice, I found a way to go to sleep when I can't sleep at night.
That's so funny.
All right. Besides yourself, what's a valuable resource for Chicago real estate investors on this topic?
Well, I'm gonna plug the Illinois Policy Institute because housing policy is one of our big focal points now, and we're doing a lot of research, permitting and ADUs and a wide range of things because we want to make housing more affordable. So we're a great resource.
All right, we'll link that in the show notes. Thank you so much. You provide a ton of value to our listeners. How can they learn more about you? Is there any way they can provide value to you?
Yeah, check out the organization, illinoispolicy.org. You can check me out on LinkedIn. I don't do Twitter or Facebook, but check me out there, and we would welcome comments, questions, queries, anything.
How can other people get involved?
Well, I think probably the most important thing for this audience is to be vocal. We talked about the NIMBY-YIMBY fight, and I think one of the things that's really changed in the last couple of years is that the YIMBY folks have realized that they need to show up and they need to be vocal because you get a lot of folks, aldermen, elected officials, behind closed doors that say, look, I'm with you, and they mean it, and just the politics of this are too hard. And if you have folks showing up at city council meetings and you have folks saying, we need more housing, and it's good for all these reasons, aldermen listen. So you got to show up. That's the most important thing. You need a coalition of folks to do that. Have your tenants show up too. That's great.
Yep. All right, it's good stuff. Chicago Fact. Who are we playing for? Who is our sponsor?
All right, we're playing for Brian Roche, maybe it's French, Roche. And Brian, if myself or Josh gets this question right, you get a $50 gift card brought to you by Kaiser Group.
All right. So you and Josh, it is multiple choice, so you guys each get a chance here. So in 1922, there's an international contest offering $100K in prize money for the design of this new building, which was eventually completed in 1925. And your options are the Tribune Tower, Chicago Motor Club, London House on DuSable, or the Chicago Theater.
It's the regular building.
I'll go with that too.
We'll go with something different just in case.
Okay, so to increase our chances, I'll go with the Chippy building.
You got it. Nice work. You knew that one?
Yeah, I knew that one.
Pretty cool. It was the 75-year anniversary. That's why they did it. And I know this just from doing the tours. They did they went and got bricks and stones from all over the world, and you can still see them there today.
Yeah.
I think since then they added one I forgot. I'm gonna butcher this, but like there's one from like the World Trade Center. I think there's one from like the moon.
Yeah.
Like there's a moon rock. Like it's pretty cool if you ever do the tour.
Yeah, they're building that big tower there now. You see that?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
My dentist is right there. I kept my dentist downtown just so I can make sure I'm go down there every once in a while, check it out.
That's awesome. All right, Brian, you $50 gift card. We got it. So $50 gift card brought to you by Kaiser Group. So that's awesome. Man, Josh, thanks for coming on here. Tom, thank you as always. Listeners, share this episode with a friend and leave us a 5-star review. That was an and, that wasn't an or, on iTunes or Spotify. You can only leave the reviews on Spotify if you're on your phone. So please do that. That helps us gain more traction and be more visible to more listeners like yourself. Josh, thank you. Tom, thank you. And listeners, we'll see you next week.